This is Chapter 1, Part 2. We left off last time talking about various basic introductory concepts, and criminality is another term that you should be familiar with. What we mean by that is a property of individuals that signals a willingness to commit crime and other harmful acts. So what we mean by this is it's a tendency that a person has to get in trouble with the law. Um, it's not like we're all equally likely to break the law and that everybody, has done something bad once, but that you don't see people have a pattern of criminal behavior. The truth is that you can really probably think of human beings as being on a continuum. From one extreme, you could think of one extreme as being like saintly people who never, hardly ever do anything wrong or harmful to other people, but especially kind, super kind, generous, empathetic, compassionate people who are just treat everybody well almost all the time. Think of that on one extreme. And then on the other extreme are your hardcore criminals, your chronic, repeat, career criminals, your murderers, your rapists, your, as an example of a severe example, a serial killer, a mass killer kind of a thing. But someone who has a long pattern of criminality, of criminal behavior. And so that's on the other extreme, the negative, bad extreme. But then in the middle, a lot of people are kind of somewhere in the middle, where they're not angels, but they're not devils either. And that they may have, when they were teenagers, maybe they got in trouble with a couple of things, but they never were hardcore criminals or a serious problem to society, right? So that's what we mean by criminality. Is sort of a, a a tendency that some people have to get into trouble with the law and to do so repeatedly and with more serious kinds of crime. That's what the focus of this course is going to be on these people who have a pattern of involvement in criminal behavior. So people are thought to lie on a continuum of highly pro-social on one end and highly antisocial on the other. Since it is a continuum, there's no sharp dividing line. So if by taking this perspective, we don't really say that it's black and white, that, oh, this person is a criminal and that this person is a saint, right? It's more, I think of it like a continuum. It's degrees of bad behavior going from one extreme to the other. So think of it that way. It's a little simplistic to say that the world is made up of two types, criminals and non-criminals. Because you have a lot of people who have tendencies towards bad behavior, but are usually pretty decent, right? So it's a little more of a sophisticated approach, getting beyond just sort of the black and white extremes. Now, the rest of the chapter, not the next section of the chapter, gets into some criminal justice terms and criminal law terms, which I don't want to stress very much, especially when we get to the part that talks about the various kind of stages as you move through the criminal justice system. I don't want to emphasize that in the lecture and also on the quiz that you'll be tested on for this chapter, because that stuff is really covered and is supposed to be covered in the introductory class. So we need to move along and get through some of these introductory materials that you see in other classes anyway. We'll take a moment, though. This is a big point, but I'll zip through it here. That this question of what constitutes a crime and its seriousness. Number one, this is a term you need to know, Corpus Delecte. What we mean by that is all the elements of an act must be present in order for it to be defined as a crime. So there's certain things that have to happen for an act, an event, an action to be criminal. And all those things, all those elements, we call this the Corpus Delecte. And so it's just a Latin term, but that's what we're referring to here. So make sure you're familiar with that term. Number two, you may have heard this one before, Actus Reuse, which means one of the elements for it to be a crime is it has to be an action. It has to be actus is an act, and action. Reuse is like prohibited action, forbidden action. A person must actually commit some form of forbidden act. So Generally speaking, in the philosophy and tradition of our laws, criminal laws, it's not criminal to have bad thoughts, to have temptations, to have, sort of unacceptable or prohibited, thinking, or even talking. Now, if you were to threaten somebody and you say, "I'm going to kill you," okay, then that's criminal when you threaten somebody like that. But if you just start sitting around and having a casual conversation and you say something like, "Oh, I'd really like to get rid of that person," you say it in passing, kind of thing. Well, that's a bad thing to say, but it's not criminal. Again, typically crimes are actions. They require actions. It's not a crime to have bad thoughts or bad attitudes or bad words about certain people. So keep that in mind. That's a pretty fundamental principle of criminal law. So is mens rea, this next one, number 3, which is it's not a crime if you don't have any intention behind the crime. Even if there's substantial harm, it doesn't mean that it's a crime if there's no intention to do harm. So let me give you an obvious example. If I'm, walking into the living room and I trip on a toy and fall and I don't know, smack my elbow smacks my wife who's sitting on the couch or something like that, and she gets a big bruise on her cheek because I accidentally, smacked her with my elbow. That's not, even though she's got a big bruise on her cheek, if somebody would have intentionally hit her in the face and bruised her cheek or something, well, that would be a crime if it was done intentionally, without justification, without self-defense or something. So, but it's not a crime in this case because it was, and I didn't mean it. It was an accident. It was purely mistake, and it was, if it's one where I'm not being reckless, you know, that if you're being reckless and you hurt somebody, then there's different levels of intent, right? And being reckless and negligent can get you into trouble criminally and legally if you're acting that way. But there has to be, at some level, a kind of intention, an intent, or at least a disregard or recklessness. If you don't have that, if you're purely innocent in your intentions, then generally speaking, it's not a crime. Now, there's always exceptions, but we're speaking in generalities here. Now, this next term, number 4, concurrence. Whether or not the criminal intention leads to the act. Example, a burglary versus a spontaneous theft. So, so yeah, you have, let me read this again, whether or not the criminal intention leads to an act. So again, this is talking about how, so you have this bad intention. I want to steal steal somebody's property. You know it's bad. You know it doesn't belong to you. And then following that plan, that intention, that you commit the crime. And of course, if there's more planning, if there's more intention, if it's more cold-blooded, if it's less spontaneous, then it's considered to be a more serious crime, because they will consider crimes to be less serious if it's something you do spontaneously without thinking. There's no planning. It happens in the moment, completely in the moment. Say you come home and you find your spouse, having a sexual relationship with somebody else, and in a moment of rage, you shoot the two of them dead. Well, they'll treat, even though that's, a terrible homicide, that's going to be treated as being a less serious crime than if you had found out that your spouse was cheating on you, and you spent several months planning the perfect cold-blooded crime to get rid of your spouse, right? That's considered more of a serious crime because of it's kind of going again to intention, that there's not spontaneity to it. It's cold-blooded planning it out, and that those two things, the plan and the action, go together. That's, hence concurrence, that they run together. Causation, number 5, is whether or not the act caused the harm. So example is a knife wound that leads to an untended infection or a death. See, so what they're trying to get at with that example is that there's the question of, did my action against you bring about the harm, or did it not? So another possible example would be, someone is really high on some drug, say meth or something, and I punch them in the face and hard enough that they require hospitalization, and then they later die in the hospital. Well, if it's the question of whether it's murder or not depends on, well, what killed this person? Was it an overdose of drugs? Or was it my assault? Was it my attack? And so if it wasn't my attack, even though what I did was a bad thing and criminal, it's not murder if it's not my actions that brought about the result, the death of this individual. So causation gets at what was key in actually bringing about the result. Was it my action or was it something else? And sometimes that can be a little bit complicated to figure that out. Finally, this one's really important, is harm, which is usually, not always, but there's a tendency in crimes, for them to be crimes, that there has to be some harm done. No harm, no foul. And so the negative impact of a crime has on a victim or to the community. So usually there's some argument, some underlying philosophy that the reason why this is criminal and why this is a crime is because somebody gets hurt. It's obvious in the case of a homicide. It's obvious in the case of rape. It's obvious in the case of aggravated assault or a theft, robbery, burglary. Somebody breaks into your place and takes all your stuff. There's obvious loss and harm there. And that's a lot of the reason why we consider it a crime, is because the person has lost something of potentially great value. And on the flip side of it, if there's no real harm done, then there's a tendency to not define that as a crime. That's not always the case, but again, we're talking about general principles here. Now, so this next slide, I'm going to speed through that and not cover these various steps through the criminal justice system. I encourage you to take a close look at this, especially if you're not very familiar with this. It's very brief and very to the point, but I'm going to skip over it in terms of lecture, and I won't be testing you on this part of it because, again, this is really material that belongs in the introductory course and is not the central focus of this course. So for that reason, trying to be concerned about moving through the material, I want to keep moving forward. And so this is the case all the way through incarceration, parole, and then we get to the sort of final couple sections of the course, which I should say of chapter 1, that I do want to talk about. The main point I want to make about this next PowerPoint highlight is that, that we've gone, if you look at the sweep of history, people have looked at crime differently in different periods of time. And the textbook breaks up these eras or periods into several periods. Let's move through these quickly. That you had prior to, say, the Renaissance started in, say, roughly, we have 1459 here, or usually they say around 1500, it varies. But prior to that time, there was a very strong tendency in traditional societies all around the world, not just Europe, generally speaking, that people would look at crime and tend to see evil in it. And that, how do we understand crime? We see it as sin. We see it as maybe influenced by evil spirits or possibly, satanic influences in certain traditions, for example, a Christian tradition and other traditions, that sort of seeing it as a looking at it very not only moralistically but sort of spiritually. That why did that person commit that horrible crime? Well, maybe they were influenced by evil influences, and that the crimes might be explained that way. So they tended to have a more supernatural or a spiritual or religious sort of understanding, because throughout much of history and around the world, people have tended to have that worldview, that outlook towards things, which was to look at things from a very sort of religious or spiritual sort of perspective. Now, there's exceptions to that, because if you look at ancient Greece and Rome, that you saw the development of the early forms of science and philosophy, which tended to take what we call a naturalistic approach as opposed to a supernatural or spiritual religious perspective. They said, oh, well, let's take a more down-to-earth approach where we only look for causes that that are what we would call natural as opposed to supernatural. So not spiritual causes of things, but more physical causes, maybe psychological, maybe thinking of the brain, and or maybe social influences, the influence of other people, but keeping spiritual explanations out of it, right? That was really kind of started in a systematic way with the ancient Greeks, but it was revived in the Renaissance, and also you see here number 3, the Enlightenment period, where as science became more mature and more developed, at first scientific method was applied towards things like the movement of planets or understanding cosmology, understanding the universe and physics, that sort of thing. Well, we saw that type of science developing first, but eventually it got applied to humans, and biology was around for a long time too, where science was applied to various species, to nature, and then eventually that idea was, well, we could apply this to humans too. So gradually throughout these eras, you saw, I think especially during the Enlightenment period, we started to see scholars, thinkers who developed theories of crime, understandings of crime that were scientific. And what we mean by scientific is that they were naturalistic. They didn't rely on spiritual explanations. They relied on down to earth kind of explanations, things like poverty, lack of money, hunger, or something like that, things like that motivated crime. And so we'll spend a lot of time this semester going over some of these theories that were developed during this Enlightenment period from 1650 to 1800. And then this was continued in the Industrial Revolution number 4 here, and the Age of Science, 1890. We'll see how things were further developed during that period of time, again, developing scientific sorts of views, and definitely sociological, social views, the idea that the type of society that you live in, the relations you have with other people might influence your behavior and cause you to become a criminal. Those sorts of ideas grew in the 1800s, as did biological evolutionary perspectives, through especially a leader in biological thought in the 1800s, Charles Darwin. The Progressive era number 5 here, 1890 to 1920, was one that definitely focused a lot on poverty, on urban conditions, big city problems that we saw as cities grew rapidly across the United States, and we had very large numbers of immigrants immigrating into these large cities across the United States. A lot of concern with urban problems and how that might be connected to crime. So we saw that during this progressive era number 5. If we move forward to number 6 here, this critical period, you saw a shift of focus during this time away from criminals and crime and more focusing on criticisms towards the criminal justice system. Let's shine the light on the criminal justice system and its problems, its shortcomings, instead of just focusing on the shortcomings of criminals, right? So you got this sort of shift in focus during this critical period, 60s and 70s. And then more recently, the modern period, say the past 30 years, there's been a blending of a lot of these various strains, and a continuation, a greater sophistication, more sophisticated methods to study these things, especially very sophisticated methods that do come out of the biological sciences, studies of the brain, neuroscience, genetics, that sort of thing has become very much more sophisticated in the past few decades. So we'll talk about all that. So the story here is increasing scientific sophistication and more moving away from the traditional spiritual explanations of why people do bad, criminal, or evil kinds of things, right? So this dominance of science has been the story for a long time. Let's see. This segment's getting a little long. We'll talk about theories in the next segment.